You are listening to Pep Talks for Artists, a podcast offering small words of encouragement to all those shuffling along the artist's road. I'm your host, Amy
Cool.
Toludo.
All right. Hello, Judy Glantzman. I'm so happy to have you on the podcast. This is a dream come true. I always love what you have to say. You're a genius. Welcome to Pep Talks.
Thank you, Amy, very much, and good morning.
I wanted to kind of rewind back and just ask you a few questions about, I know that you were born in Long Island and you had an artist parent, your mother. Could you talk a bit about how, what it was like growing up with an artist parent or what her work was like?
I think in retrospect, it was such an impact on me. I mean, my mother, one thing that she always gave us a space to work where she was working. And I believe that she gave me a kind of, like, it was sort of ABEX kind of ideas. And so the idea of intuition, or the idea of, she didn't really have any kind of connection to imagery at all. Like, even if you looked at a kind of a, medieval painting, she would just ignore all of the imagery, but she understood something about how to move in a picture and how to look at things. And so really, for my mother, art was like the temple. And my one sister was a business person, and she was sort of like the black sheep of the family. So
the black sheep.
Art was revered. And then I realized in teaching that I actually had also taught sort of the opposite. In other words, I sort of took some of her examples and went the other way. And she was a designer. She was studied as interior designer. And so I started to think about the difference between designing a painting and finding meaning in a painting. And I think in that way, my mother had limits to how deeply she could sort of delve into the work and sort of dig into it, so that it wasn't really just like an aesthetic decision of how things were arranged, but that the kind of arrangements had meaning that you could kind of, investigate. So I think that she impacted me in two ways tremendously, both, and even in terms of being an artist myself. I saw things that I would have wanted to change with her, and I understood also the kind of core of your, to have art as the center of your life, and how, meaningful and exciting and fun that is. So those were two ways. My mother was originally painted in oil. We lived in Puerto Rico for a while, and she painted abstract expressionist kind of paintings, and those are beautiful. And then acrylic was invented, I guess. And so she started to make work and worked from acrylic for the rest of her life. And some of the paintings are really beautiful. And it's actually over time, like, without her, my mother died, I think like 7 years ago. And that I'm sort of, as I've grown to be able to see the work more and more. So she was a really great artist.
And a bit cutting edge for her to, like, on the fly change to acrylic, because wasn't acrylic just getting invented then?
Definitely. I mean, she was always, so she didn't really, we lived in Great Neck when I was little, and then my parents divorced and we moved to the city. We moved to the city in 1967. And she always had a studio, and she had studio visits. My mother, the other thing about her was that she had a terrible time letting go of any artwork or even exhibiting or any artwork. There was always that anticipation, I think, that all artists have, that the next one is really going to be the one. And so there was a kind of a paralyzing part of her that I think for me motivated me to push myself beyond that the life of the work exists in a way outside of you, and so that was something else in terms of just like a lifetime of making artwork that I learned from her.
And why do you think that she was afraid to exhibit? Was it just a fear of failure or judgment?
Well, yes. I think like the idea of judgment is such a big part of what we do, and even in terms of part of what I try to help myself with or teach. But I think that she actually also she didn't want to, like, I once helped her to arrange an exhibition of her works on Mulberry Street in the library, but it was a really beautiful little space. But she really was very upset about it. I mean, I think she really wanted to keep her oeuvre together to get to the Museum of Modern Art, and that's where that work should be seen. And so I think it is, like, even for me, fear of rejection is all about insecurity. Mm-hmm. And also it's such a fragile enterprise that in a way, you want to protect the things that you make. But I think we're communicators. We want to communicate. That's really what we're trying to do. And so I think that when I was a student, my first year, I had a teacher, David McCauley, and he asked us, is it an artwork if you never show it to anybody? And it was such a good provocative question. And I think, like, there's times to show and not to show, but I think it really is essential to allow the work to live in the world, like as if they're your offspring, and that they have their own life beyond you, and that it's, it becomes alive when it's interacting with other people. So, yeah, I think that division between art and design, and really sharing all the same components, but really have a very different intent and purpose. Mm-hmm. And the idea of sort of getting lost in it or revealing yourself in the work as an artist is essential, but it is very uncomfortable.
Very uncomfortable. And I love how you said that she brought you into her workspace, because I was reading recently an interview you had with Jennifer Samet at Beer with a Painter and Hyperallergic, and she had recalled visiting you in your studio and when your daughter Lila was young, a toddler maybe, and that she was just sort of in the mix. Like you had a curator visiting, and you were like, here's my toddler, and you didn't kind of like shove her off with a babysitter, which, no shade, of course, sometimes you need to do that, but that she noted that you really blended life and art together, and you worked from home. And is that something that's really feeds your work, to have life and art merged?
Well, I mean, I think sometimes I think of it like plumbing. Like basically what I want to do is be sort of porous and have things come into my world and then go out. And so I had a separate studio for a long time, and I really actually bothered me even the kind of professionalism of what I was doing. Like it kind of, but not to mention, like in the middle of the night, you might have an idea, like there's a kind of a seamless thread or connection that you don't have to break by leaving your space and coming back into it. But I really do want, and Lila, on so many ways, well, also because I learned to work with her in one arm and doing things in another. And I think that women or mothers learn, or parents learn to do that. But her life force, like even the earlier sculptures I made before she was even born, I feel like are her. And so in a way, I sort of made this of an amalgam of people that I was looking at all the time, her vulnerability. And even most recently, even when I think about, teaching and how you might learn from your own work, the idea of like watching her play and that kind of quality of absolutely genuine play and sincere play, but at the same time being fully aware of the artifice of it is so inspirational in children. I mean, it's talk about plumbing, talk about a direct link between what they feel and what they say, you know what I mean? And then the other piece with Lila was that I started to realize that if, as an artist, or in any way as a parent, if she was acting in a certain way and I perceived that as reflecting me as a mother, I actually restricted what things she was going to do. But in other words, your art is separate from you. So if I'm worrying that my art reflects me as a good artist, then I will limit and hinder the work. But if I accept that it's separate from me, and it's sort of, again, back to Abek's idea, like it's the remnants of an experience, then I don't have to, then I can look at it and learn from it instead of sort of, back to the idea of judgment.
Or control, like you relinquish controlling an outcome, just like you would let a child be their own person.
That's right. I think that, I'm sorry. No, but the idea of controlling an outcome, or even the idea of something that predisposes, that leads you in a certain kind of way, it's that's really that kind of I read one quote, if you preassume what something's going to be, you're always going to be disappointed. And so it's not just not controlling the outcome, but it's actually really hindering the outcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree 100%. That was very, very inspirational to me. But I wanted to circle back a little bit because I want to talk more about Sculpey, but first I wanted to just talk a bit about a painting that you made. Let me just look here. Okay, so speaking of Lila, I wanted to speak about a painting that you made in 2006 called A Valentine for Lila, which is oil on canvas 80 by 70. And it's basically a balloon of little heads encircled with a white outline, which is also little heads. And it sort of hovers over a greenish color that's cluttered with star shapes. And it read to me when I saw it as a celebration of childhood, or even childhood art. The little stars recollected to me things that my son would bring home from nursery school, like his little Christmas ornaments. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that painting. I know it was a long time ago, but.
Well, I mean, I try to order my thoughts because it's always like, but one of the things is in terms of what we just said about presuming something. there was a big moment where I said to myself, I love to paint the figure, but I don't want to paint the whole body. I just want to paint the heads. And in a funny kind of way, that was like a breaking of a rule. And then I started to think about those heads and the clusters of heads as being like DNA, or being like, pearls that are stringed together. And I think, like, when I was thinking about talking this morning, I was thinking how everything in a painting is dynamic. And so in some ways, or even how repetition is a freedom for me to sort of, when I repeat a kind of a motif, I can go the variations on that particular, motif. And so those kind of ideas of not controlling what the, and it's funny because it actually relates to work that I did more recently, where the idea of the artist is not really to make the event, but to make the framework for the event to occur. And so in those, they're kind of like, like holding a kind of a circle that the event occurs inside. Those are some of my last oil paintings, because I moved back to that. I stopped using oil paint when I moved back home. But I think a lot about it, kind of providing myself a kind of a place or a freedom to work on things. So that idea of a kind of one string that creates a kind of a, like as if all of our loved ones and all of our ghosts hover and are in us, the same as having a child, where you see like a piece of somebody and a piece of somebody else, but that the threads of the connections between them are ever changing, that they're kind of, they're impacting each other. So I think that, but I also think, and I really, it's interesting because I during COVID, I became clearer on the idea that being an artist could be a generous act in terms of gift giving, that the things that we're making are kind of and so I love the idea that it's a gift for Lila, because, I think that idea of play and of childlike qualities, or losing the things that you sort of think, will gussy it up or make it seem better. I'm always in search of trying to find the way to return to that real impulse. And but it is a long time ago.
I love the idea of interpreting that painting, also thinking about how much not only the ancestors that came before in a big like hovering ball above your head, because it is, but also that every head in that ball could also be little fragments of different people that become you. And that's a really interesting idea to me. And then when you said that art is like a gift, it reminded me of something I just read that I think I'll incorporate in a new podcast by a stand-up comedian, where they said that if you go on stage and you're expecting to receive, you're expecting to receive laughs, you're expecting to receive, lots of people coming and appreciating you, perhaps you're expecting to receive reviews, it's the wrong mindset. You should go up and give laughs. You're giving a generous part of yourself to the world. And it just resonated with what you just said. And I think that would just eliminate a lot of those sort of crippling feelings of jealousy and compare and despair, if you kind of could switch your mindset to giving versus expecting.
I mean, just like the thing of expecting the painting, and we're humans, we can't really help it, but it's true. It's like, and I think that, like my black sheep sister,
Right.
She, I think she's always felt sad that she didn't have art in her life, because it is something that's a wonderful thing to have, but she makes it as gifts. And if she has the reason to do somebody's, a poster for someone coming home, or a thing that somebody asked her to put something in, or a card, then she has no problem in making it. And I think I think that in all, like the kind of crippling jealousy, and it's hard to, acknowledge, but it's a horrible feeling in each of us. But I think that the idea that somehow is separated from yourself, that these are things that are out in the world, and that you sort of receive them, and, you can come in and out of them. I think that that's if you think of it as a gift, then it takes that judgment away from it.
Yeah. And it feels like you just have a temporary illness.
Right.
And then you recover.
Right.
And you're healthy again.
That's right.
So I wanted to just, because we started with you growing up and your mom, which was really interesting to me, I wanted to just go back also to a subject I'm really curious about, which was being in the East Village during the time the East Village was the East Village, like the 80s. And, it's a big subject because it's full of intense grief and loss, but it's also this wild, crazy, drug-infused, colorful, brash, playful place. Also, it contains everything in a weird way, in this really like raw way. And I know that you showed with several galleries in the neighborhood, like Civilian Warfare and Gracie Mansion. And I did want to ask you, I saw a little tantalizing tidbit that your work was sort of taken down from a city corp headquarters when you were showing with Civilian Warfare. Could you elaborate?
That was the craziest thing. So I mean, I just feel very fortunate to have been in that place, right place, right time. But I also think that the rawness of it actually was in sync with who I am, and so there was a kind of shared thing. I had a St. Peter's Church in City Court building on 59th Street, I guess, in Lexington, has a chapel, a space down below, and they have exhibitions. And it was kind of it was like a rec room, like it had a low ceiling. So even I was already, my friend and I had rented a little place, teeny place in the Hamptons, and it was freezing. It was like May, and I was making these cutouts, and I thought rather than hang things on the wall, I would make things freestanding, because just for the space, which actually ended up impacting the work for a long time. So I was out in the Hamptons, and I made all these cutouts, and they were collapsible. So they went on the jitney with like the whole show, like plywood pieces, and set it up. And the figures were sort of quote bathers, but really they were very, very raw feeling. They certainly weren't realistic. And their bathing suits were like hysterical, enormous pieces of color, like just basically. And that show opened, and we had a wonderful opening. And then the next day they contacted me and they said, people have complained and they have to take the show down, and they called it pornographic.
Because they were wearing bikinis?
And
how far we've come.
I know. It was really, but it was so I went back in, collapsed all those things, and took them out of there.
Wow, so that was sort of the conservative pushback against art at that level. Like you were going to get, like, basically your show was going to be taken down if you painted a bikini level. Like,
and we at that time, that thing of like, you don't want to go above 14th Street. Like, basically it kind of reinforced the fact that we could have, in our own world, we had our own set of rules, and we had our own community, and so we didn't have to be impacted by other external things. That was one of the greatest things about it. It was like its own ecosystem. It just kind of developed, its own pieces, so that you didn't really have to deal with people like that. But it was so absurd. It was just hysterically absurd. And they were, but that idea, one kind of the innovation of like, okay, I'll make it stand, freestanding, was really a great thing. And they were very, I still am repairing some of those three-dimensional pieces, but they have a kind of a great, MacGyver kind of quality of like everything about it had the quality of like Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney. We just.
How so?
In the East Village, well, it was basically like, the kids are running the show, and we will just figure out, we will just go ahead and do it. Like if we're going to put on a play,
like child actors.
Yeah.
And I noticed that you had a body of work in the 80s that was basically silhouette of faces or cut out shapes. And there's even this amazing photo I found of you putting on a show. I think it was at Stephen Adams Gallery in 1985. And the review of it was called Judy Glantzman Cuts Up Her Friends. And everyone it's just like 50 people in a black and white photograph, all just clustered holding cutouts of paintings you did of them. Could you, what inspired that show?
Well, everyone's these are my career moves. Like,
this was your calculated career move.
So over time, I've worked mostly from my imagination, but over time I've hit a kind of wall, and when I've hit a wall, I go back to observation. And so these were all observed, and the show itself was called Glantzman Cuts Up Her Friends, and there were 66 portraits. They were, again, back to our own ecosystem. That was a portion of the ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And so people would come, and I have a little video of it. When they came, I would do the whole thing while they sat. So it took about 3 hours. So they would come, I would draw it on Luan, I would cut it out with a jigsaw, all the while kind of talking, keeping them kind of occupied, glue the thing together, again, MacGyver-like, and then paint on it. And so that created even more of a community for me, because once you start reaching out to people, then you start to meet people. Like I was saying to, I did a portrait of Jimmy DeSanta, and he came and he brought his little frame portrait of his Dalmatian. Like people came and they'd thought about it before. So it was during one of those kind of, it was 1985, and it was kind of like a, I would say that 83, 84 was really a fantastic year for me. But by 85, even though it was sort of, it seemed the same, it wasn't. It had kind of changed. There was a lot more competition, and there was a lot, it suddenly had a kind of market. Once you have that market, the whole thing shifted.
Yeah.
So this was a very it was a very lovely way to, kind of go hang out with somebody for the afternoon. And then, and then we had their portrait. And the other thing is the 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional thing, because they were kind of torqued so that they actually became little sort of sculptural pieces.
Yeah, that photo was amazing. It just connoted like the sense of joy. And like you said, just art with the freedom from that market, where the market is kind of prescribing what people make. You could just do anything. It felt that feeling. Yeah.
And that, isn't that the goal? I mean, if you're going to be an artist, isn't that the goal?
I hope. Well, you think it's, but I love that. I did dig up this quote. Well, I didn't have to dig that deep. It was from May 2020, that you wrote on Painters on Painting. And you wrote the quote in the context of the pandemic, but I was thinking of it in the context of the East Village, because I get that feeling freedom from the photos and the stories from that time. And your quote is, "I hope for the collapse of the machine that co-ops art with money. I hope New York returns to a gritty and creative world." And to me, it could fit just as well with a looking back towards that time.
People look at the time means a lot, and I've also, when I do a talk, sometimes I'll put a photograph of David Wojnarowicz and Mike Bidlow sitting at the pier. And the pier was really the beginning kind of glue for all of us to get together, and also out of generosity. I mean, basically, I was included in a group show. I didn't know these people, and they said, "Come down to the pier." And that's what it was. It was just a word of mouth. In retrospect, of course, not everybody was included. I just happened to be there at that time, but it felt like that. And even in the pier itself, people were very respectful of other people's work. There wasn't any kind of, you basically took there was plenty of room, but you didn't, you understood there was something kind of magical happening. And I guess the magical quality was the freedom and art itself. So the individuals were just participating, but we'd actually and even in terms of the space itself, or like what you said about historic, like when I teach, the idea for students of the East Village, it means a lot to them. And one of the things that in the photograph I show of David and Mike Bidlow is that just find a space, it can happen anywhere. And it's and at that time in New York, that was a possibility.
Could you explain a bit what the pier was, in case other people might not have heard of it?
So it was on, there were I lived on Christopher Street, and there were all these piers along the water, and they were very, definitely very run down. And they were also a place of having a lot of sex. Like in the piers, there was also these trucks, big, where they were just basically, it's like sex, but the
sex in a truck.
Sex in a truck. Like oh, I'm gonna forget his name. Gordon Matta Clark had made an image of a cutout on one of these buildings on the pier, a big shape that he had actually cut out of the building. And on the pier that we were doing, this artist, very good artist, John Fechner, had written in kind of computer writing in reference to the Gordon Matta Clark. I didn't even really know about the Gordon Matta Clark at that point. So there was kind of a total gay scene happening. And this abandoned building on the pier that was, I think it was at Spring Street and the water, and it was when the docks were still working. They looked like one day they just packed up, they didn't take anything, and it just left. So when you walked into this place, you had to go break in, kind of crawl in, and then it was very, very dark, but it was a beautiful, Beaux-Arts kind of federal building, and with marble stair, but everything in decay, really you're looking at decay. And the first guy was, now I'll forget his name, Flynn, I think, and he had put these little figures made of garbage bags. So it was kind of, your eyes adjusted, and it's sort of scary because you suddenly see these kind of figures.
Yeah.
The ceiling had collapsed on a lot of it. And I didn't realize at the time that David had planted grass seed. So baby grass was beginning to grow. And it was really like looking at the end of the Roman Empire, the collapse of one empire. Yeah. They were ledgers. David and Kiki Smith found drawings made from Creedmoor, I think, of mental hospital drawings for the patients.
Wow.
And so it was it was already a really magical space. And then different people just, I just grabbed a couple of gallons of paint and a paintbrush on a stick, and just like we were able to take over. But part of it was the magic of the place itself, and part of it in terms of time. We were relatively young people, but you were seeing like the end of one thing and the beginning of another. So that's what the pier was. And
was it was like basically a one big collaborative installation?
Exactly. But it was, like this guy Huck Snyder did the bathrooms. So like there were different rooms that you could do, you know what I mean? It was like one, it was like it had been a big office. So one room after another, they had like even the little window kind of things. And you were free to just go, as long as you heard about it word of mouth, you were free to, welcome to go in. There were these wonderful little sculptures that were put in all the niches, and I think those things were stolen. But other than that, I don't think it was like basically like a very cool space that anybody could do what they wanted at any time.
And so the only people who could really witness it or see it were the other artists that participated. It wasn't like open to other people.
No, but there was this guy, Andreas Sturzig. Like I said, we had our own ecosystem, and Andreas was a young guy from Germany, and he had done some freelance journalism, and he came upon it. And so if you look up Andreas Sturzig, he has incredible he's not the only one, but he has a really expansive documentation of that. And we became friends in a way during that time. It was like we were all there together. It was very, it really was a magical time. And, it's hard not to talk about real estate in New York.
It's really hard.
Because that was an opportunity that, that was actually the gentrification, that it was just like preceding everything, but it was preparing for it. And so we were able to live and not work a lot, and not paying jobs so much. The rents were not expensive. That's just such a different.
It's so different. I don't think a person today could imagine that situation. But you mentioned David Wojnarowicz. I know you were great friends and often collaborated with him.
Never collaborated.
I thought, you helped him install some
shows,
and you both went to you did the mural in Kentucky, and you helped a bit. Maybe you were more of like a kindly friend. A helper.
It was only one time that David asked me something like visually, like, what do you think I should do with this painting? And I told him one idea, which he did. It was like it was a Peter Hujar with like sort of a Saint Sebastian. I said to put a little more red on the tips of those doors, and that was the idea.
Otherwise, Peter Hujar was his longtime partner, and they both sadly died in the AIDS epidemic. Could you talk a bit about your friendship with David, and how maybe he influenced your work during that time?
Well, I mean, David was an incredible artist, and I'm very fortunate to have gotten to know him. And you mentioned going to Louisville, Kentucky. That's really, we were colleagues. We showed at the same gallery, and I knew him. But it wasn't until we went to Louisville that we got to be really good friends. And it was really Peter. I believe that Peter had maybe already died, and David was pretty sure that he was going to be, HIV positive. And so my relationship with David, except that I was very poor, so he was very nice, and he hired me as his assistant. And I was like, everything he told me to do, I did. I was just the opposite kind of person than him. He would sitting with David when he was doing this show, and I'm kind of a relatively anxious person. David was just sitting there smoking cigarettes, for like a million cigarettes. He's looking out the window, it's like his spot. And I'm thinking, oh my God, we got to get started. This thing has got to, but he sat there until his form, like basically it cooked in his brain so clearly that by the time it came out, it was a fully formed idea, just in terms of how he spoke. And just somebody who's, was such an artist of so much integrity. I mean, basically, David was a great example, because he didn't have it in his capacity to do anything, but it just was who he really, it wouldn't have been possible. He would bristle at it so much to be untrue, or to, be less than giving and actually it was revealing to me after he died, and we were sort of putting things together in his place, that every single thing of his, every symbol of his had been researched and found in in sixth grade science books. It's like the dung beetle, it's like all kinds of things that he found in there that he took on as his own. I mean, really,
like a burning house.
Exactly. He tells a great story. It's a film that hasn't been really, like, wasn't edited, but he had a retrospective in Normal, Illinois, and he's talking about the work. So he talks about this one thing. It's a globe, and from the globes are these things hanging down. There's like a cow. There's this string. There's a cow. There's a house. And he said it was like his third grade teacher or whatever said to him, "If you didn't have gravity, this is what it would look like." And so she made an image of it that he ended up making this.
Oh my gosh! So all that from those textbooks in elementary school
Exactly.
created his entire vocabulary.
And I think it is elemental, and it means, like, the thing about David's work is it operates on a lot of levels, and so if you even read the writings, it's kind of a direct thing, but the paintings themselves, they're really complicated, they're complex, and the series of relationships are complex. You can see them on a lot of different levels, and I think that he was looking at he was finding his own vocabulary. He was creating his set of letters, and so then they reconfigured in different kind of ways. And even sometimes from dreams, or sometimes coming to him from other situations. You know what I mean? He was receiving information, certainly in terms of AIDS and activism. The world itself was on fire, and he was a voice, a very important, essential voice for articulating what was going on. And I even think that with David that, he would talk about invisibility, or like not seeing himself as being mirrored in the culture, and how much art or visibility, or what is visible and what isn't visible, is so powerful in terms of our information and how we process things. Even, in fact, the idea that an artist is somebody who wants to uncover the things that maybe are a little bit under the surface but are there, and I think that so he's got his own set of little icons that he letters that he reconfigures.
Yeah, and you can feel that kind of that era of the 80s, like how the government let everyone down, like let people die, basically. They were slow to fund research and combating this epidemic. And so people were just dying left and right. And it just felt like there was Reagan and nobody cared. And so you can really feel that sort of rage in the work. And I think, rightfully so, like you said, it's not filtered and it shouldn't be.
Well, I mean, the idea that illness would have a moral component, is like the morality of it, and the kind of like, the hypocrisy of it, the hypocrisy of that kind of morality. But we did, with a group of friends of David's, we did this quilts for the, AIDS,
for the AIDS memorial. Yeah.
We did it during the pandemic. And so it was kind of a parallel to the difference in similarities of a pandemic versus, during the AIDS crisis. It was sort of like Nazi Germany. Like, some people were being impacted, but everybody else was just moving along in their life as if life was normal.
So you're saying it was like almost different because the pandemic affected across the board. So there was sort of this push, and it wasn't a moral failing, and the government was helping research.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm sure there's some corners it was a moral thing, and people were getting what they deserved. But this, the idea that you were free to do, the people that were, homosexuality was like that. That was it. You were just, evil, and so that this is your comeuppance. This is what I mean, for me, like, I did, and I think this is Reagan and AIDS killed that sense of freedom, that sense of the spirit, and actually we're still in the middle of doing, like, trickle down. We're still in the same place. One of the things that you feel like as you get older is like, oh my God, we're here again, the same place that we were before, different outfits.
Yeah, different outfits, the same place. I brought up David is because he's so important to that scene. He was referred to as like the soul of the East Village. So I just wanted to paint a fuller picture of that time, and also in relation to your work. But you also have a piece called Dark Prayer from 2016 that features images of David repeated. It also, some of these works have sort of a loose, chaotic quilt structure where there's a border of repeated symbols, and then little squares of symbols repeat here and there within the composition. In this particular one, there are images, that kind of stereotypical image of the prayer hands you'll see in Christian literature repeated. There's also a pair of slippers in the bottom. There's a dark, sooty mass. And then from the mass, there's also some boats included, and emerging from this darkness are images of David with his signature glasses and another man who I wasn't sure who. I just was wondering if you could talk about that piece, Dark Prayer.
Well, so I have to talk about Dawn for a minute, because Dawn Clements. So Dawn and I were teaching up at RISD, and actually I had a week's time. I was going to Vermont Studio Center, and I was going to bring, I said I wanted to really make a big piece, but I didn't want to bring it. So Dawn said to me, oh, just fold up a big piece of paper and you can carry it anywhere. And if you know Dawn Clements' work, that's what she did.
Yeah,
so,
beautiful work.
So because I was going on the train and doing, drawing on the train, one of the things that I knew was that even if I didn't know, I wasn't looking at the whole thing when I was making it, but I did know where the border edge was. So that one of the reasons for like kind of going those sort of repeated motif all around the whole border, which makes it kind of like a big rug in a way, like they were me not knowing compositionally where anything else was, but I could know what that was. And as I said earlier, the idea of repetition itself has a kind of freedom for me, and it's kind of like the variations on a motif that you can kind of see the difference in that sort of sort of meat of it. The images of David in the squares are of a photograph that was taken by his brother when he was about 7. And so it's like, I think, and I did some with Dawn too as a child, because I think there is that kind of, there's a communing. When you're making an image from the photograph, especially over and over, you're having a visit with the person. And then the other thing is that you're sort of seeing it in that kind of moment before self-consciousness, where you're just sort of freer to be who you are. And he's kind of, and like you said, it's signature. He looks the same. He's got those.
You could identify him.
And I think it's like those glasses, like the aviator, kind of weird. But he, so it was almost then somebody mentioned, not about this one, but I did one like this for Dawn, and they said it was something like as if a grave had been overgrown. And I love that idea, and even the idea of a calendar. So these things are just layering images as if the same way that we experience the world. They come in, they go out, they layer, they seem to make other things, and they're kind of buried underneath. The prayer hands are exactly as you said. I found a little card with one of these sort of things that you could hold, and so I was looking for my own kind of symbols. But the idea that I used to think of it just as loss, the idea of grieving, or the idea of people disappearing, or that there's something about the accumulation of experiences. That's one way of thinking of the image. The little shoes were a gift from a friend of mine. The pictures around that whole thing are Lila, I'm pretty sure, made in Sharpie.
I was wondering who that young woman was in the border. Yeah.
And so I guess in a way you could think of these as being somewhere between me and David. The conversation that I'm having is bringing the things that I have in my life, and then his images through it, and finding the boat itself was a thing when Canal paints,
Pearl Paint on Canal
Thank
Street.
you.
Yeah.
When they went out of business, I went there and I got as much stuff as I could. And one of them was a little model of a canoe set. And so I built myself a little canoe. And there's a great Charles Garabedian painting of a man going away in a canoe.
Oh yeah, I love that piece. Yeah.
And it's, the idea of death, or the idea of something moving on, or the idea of being kind of carried out to something.
Like a Viking funeral or something.
Exactly. And I think also I wanted to, when we talked about a gift of things, I think that at that point, probably earlier from my imagination, my impulse was to make things kind of gruesome. And when I started to make paintings like as a memorial to somebody, I really tried to make them as beautifully as I could, and so that was something that was very freeing to me. So it wasn't just a gift. It was kind of the idea that that there's a kind of that there's a balm that the beauty brings, that there's a quality that just giving something, that trying to make it as beautiful as you possibly can. And then of course, acknowledging that it'll never be as beautiful as it'll always come up short. It just can't be what nature gives us. It's just that magical thing. But yeah, like the idea of a kind of we're in this, the idea of the framework, that's what I was starting to say earlier, that they started from that. The reason I did it was just ease of knowing where the edge was. So it was some kind of it oriented me. But the idea that as an artist, we don't have to control what the whole thing means or what it comes together, just like life. We just have to have a framework within which to experience the kind of chaotic or random or, so in those, there was a kind of a division of three things. One was the emblem, and I would say the emblem was like the repeated motif or the picture of David, the physicality of paint, and that would be the dripping or, where paint itself acted. And the third thing would be the illusion. And in the illusion, those were where the flowers, where actually it was a kind of an observational thing. So they weren't really meant to, they were more, the notion that I really wasn't going to get the flower, but that I could sit in front of it and try as best to get that flower as I could, had a kind of not just a beauty of it, but also kind of a poignant way of a giving up of some of my perfection. Like I wasn't, I had aspired to something, but I also, there's a kind of a beauty in the fact that you acknowledge it's an impossible ambition. It's just, and so I think with all those three things together, to me, sort of started to feel like the painting was animate, and that it would cluster and attach to other things, and it would find it so that you could find your own meaning in it as well.
Yeah, I love the idea too that the flowers could contribute to that balm you mentioned, that kind of creating a beautiful homage, tribute to this lost person. If listeners, I'm sure every listener knows Dawn Clement's work, but she sadly died. And was it 2018?
I'm not sure. I keep trying to remember.
But she was an incredible artist who worked on paper, would create these large, like wall large drawings. Would be ink.
Sometimes it was Sumi ink, and sometimes it was ballpoint pen.
Ballpoint pen, and they were very, very organic feeling. Like they looked like they just kind of spread into different shapes depending on her whim. And so Judy's painting is actually called Dawn Clement's, and it's from 2019, and you can look that up. And it's part like Dark Prayer. It's a large work on paper that's made with ink and acrylic and graphite, I think.
Graphite and Sharpie.
And Sharpie, yeah. Who doesn't need a Sharpie once in a while, I ask you. Also, Magic Eraser gets Sharpie out, FYI, if you ever need.
Good to know.
You never need to. And moving on a little bit, since we were talking about David and Dawn, just turn the page. I wanted to just kind of touch on an observation that a lot of your work, speaking of flowers too, is a flowering from grief, or memorials in a lot of ways. Not only, of course, but seems to be a core content. So we spoke about the dark prayer, Dawn Clement's, but there's also Reach, which is an installation of 17 carved wooden hands that I heard in a recent podcast you said was inspired by the loss of your mother, or memories of your mother. Would you mind talking a bit about Reach, the installation?
Well, so I've always had a kind of ability to go back and forth between three-dimensional and two-dimensional things. And I think with the three-dimensional things, because I don't think of myself as a sculptor per se, that I give, there's some freedom in it. I really love the three-dimensional works. And I wasn't really thinking that, what happened was that I had these, carving tools. I had made another sculpture before, so I had these carving tools. I was sitting out on my porch here, and there's sticks all around.
Yeah,
I started to do.
Judy lives in upstate New York, so there's lots of sticks.
I felt like I was like an old whittler on the shelf,
in your rocking chair.
Exactly. And I don't know, I guess the thing looked a little bit like a hand to me, so that's how I started to carve it. But when I was carving it, it was my mother's hand. It was just like, and I think that it's, of course, my hand. You know what I mean? It's like, but it really was like, and so in the most ghoulish way, there's a kind of a quality of them kind of like
a zombie or something coming up from the
cracking off of the. But I think that and I've thought about this a lot, that for me, when you said about being raw, like that moment between when it's still that piece of wood and it is the hand at the same time, so it's not seamlessly becomes something else. It's actually in the minute, in the time when they're kind of both occurring at the same time, which I think is actually the big dichotomy of making art altogether, that it's a piece of something that we can hold. I know it's a piece of wood, and at the same time it transforms into something else. That's a really thrilling thing. So I started to, but I realized, and I was making the hands, that like I actually was holding the hand as I was making it. Like there was and I think about this a lot, that these are my companions, and that we visit each other, and so with the hands, And now I'm making these hands in clay. So it's very interesting because it's really a different process than making the hands. And so sometimes with the hands in clay, I just take the clay and put it around my finger to just make it into the finger itself. But there was something fragile about the wood because you could really easily sort of make that mist thing and the thumb just comes off. And I think that it's not just grief. And it is for sure. But I think there is also, even in the flowers, the idea of transience, the idea, like I remember Dawn speaking about these big tulips that she made, and she used to make them very, very large, so that by the end of so she was making those, the flowers died as she continued to make the drawings. Mm-hmm. And I think like that idea of, I talk about the white paintings. I used to say, like, I think that as I got older, I realized that I would disappear too. Like at first, I just thought that it was like we were the matter. I would say early on that like being a figurative painter is a way of taking ideas of emotion, taking feelings, and finding a figurative form for them. And then I realized that form is a transient thing. And so even the idea of the form itself is something which is disappearing. And I think that it is, and maybe that becomes clear as you go older, I think.
But also it must, you really lived through a pandemic and the AIDS crisis. I mean, that's, you were faced with incredible loss. It can't help but have affected your worldview.
And it was loss, like when you talk about like somebody who's older, who's dying, where they sort of like their body decays, but these were people that were just like magical, beautiful, full of life, shiny people, full of everything. And I think like that also, that kind of physical decay or that kind of, but it's true. And I think it is true of the pandemic, and it's true of any kind of loss that it's almost the most incomprehensible that physical form doesn't exist anymore. It's just beyond, it's now I think that it's, and I think also having Lila had a big impact on how I made things. And so I sometimes think that like that was the gain. Like, in other words, if the other's about physically losing, she didn't exist in the world, and then she became like a physical thing, like, and I cooked her, like
yeah, you cooked her, right? And her cells went into you and your cells went into her. And
right.
I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about working from home, like your strategy of working from home, because I think a lot of the listeners can relate to maybe they can't afford their studio or they have a small child, so they're home and they may think, this is not ideal, I can't make work here. But of course, I feel like when in our conversations, discovered that it's actually the heart of the work. Like that is the place you're most radical. That is the place you're bravest. But in terms of parenting, juggling parenting, I wanted to talk about this one painting that I love from the White series, I think, which is called She Juggles. So it's kind of a little bit part of the working from home section of the podcast interview, but She Juggles is from 2006 and it's 36 by 36 oil on canvas, and it's this amazing painting of a gray ochre background, and there's a central figure with a barrel chest and a red belt with a bow and a big green skirt, and inside the barrel chest it's royal blue background, and there are these golden little heads stacked like columns coming up the body, and then there's a gray ghostly head with clenched teeth at the top, and there are these two oversized hands drawn with white paint that are somewhat juggling an arc of little heads. So there's like an upside down U, a little head. Some are white, but they kind of move into transparency. And then on the left side of the painting, one of the hands is just holding a whole nother head that's a big brown head. And it just, I mean, the painting is incredible because it's so creative and has a vicious creativity and imagination, but it's also so how one feels. one is juggling it all. Like you're juggling your painting, your art, your kid, your bills, your job, and all that. And it just I thought it would be a good segue into talking about your ideas. Well, just like your radical idea about that working at home is the bravest place to work.
I'm glad you like that painting. You know how you, over the years, like you start to think, like, I love that painting. And then I said, well, that's not so, like, I've kind of dismissed that. That painting was made after the White series. And it was, I think, one of the challenges of, it's sort of like a painting idea is a challenge of working over time on a painting. And so, like, for me, but I think that, so I'm glad that you picked that painting out, because I sort of pushed it over to the,
Don't push it over there.
Don't push it over there. Thank you. And so part of it was what I said before, that I gave myself permission to not make bodies if I wanted to make heads. Like, I could make them string along and they could do different kind of things. But yeah, it was very, I mean, I think it's hard. And especially now that, so, we have a professional life as an artist.
Yeah.
That I knew that for me that wasn't good. Like, basically, even just the idea of kind of getting back into that place, like, in other words, you wake up in that place in your home, you're already there. Like, if you could manage to get downstairs and start before you even, just don't even brush your teeth, just basically get down there and start that thing. Or even, like I said, the middle of the night, that there's a kind of a you don't break that flow. It's a kind of a continuum. It's just a part of your whole thing. But we're so, I keep thinking about this. I teach a lot, and I think about, like, whatever that professionalism is really a destructive force to me. And
in
so
the art, I like to have like an art, to be focused on an art career, so to speak. It's not necessarily, it's a cultural shift, and that artists are expected to be professional now, and it's detrimental.
I mean, when I've always wanted to be at home, but my husband didn't. He first, I think he was being very generous. Like, again, I would never have made those giant paintings at home. I just couldn't have made them.
Yeah.
But he also, when he moved back home, I think he was afraid it would just be too much. And so finally, but so for a while, I had this very expensive, beautiful studio, but it was killing me. And it was like, I felt like I was like, time to make the donuts, made the donuts.
Right.
Like, I was bringing my attaché case to my studio, it's like, and I think that pressure to make things and how to pay the bills that way is also really a kind of a pressure on the work. And it isn't, so I guess, like, when you say it's the bravest, is in a way what we're looking for is to get rid of all that stuff. So whatever is left after that, you know what I mean? All the things that you should have, or the things that will, those things are meaningless to us. And to get to the, and I have to say that being up here in Chatham has been really helpful to me, to work in quiet and to have full, and even, like I say to you before about company, like, I work here by myself, so my friends are my people that I make.
You're making your own visitors.
My own friends.
You're hosting your work.
And it also is very complicated, because it's hard to hear your own voice. Very, very hard. That's the hardest thing, because your own voice is also developing, and each time you say it, the means of which you say it is a different, But I think that I've had this happen more than once. Like, for a while, when I don't remember, it wasn't just at home. I think even making things in bed. So at one point, like, I started to I was still using oil paint, and I was in bed, but the things were canvas, they weren't stretched. And it suddenly I said to myself, if I just think of these as fabric rather than paintings, I have a lot more freedom to do whatever I want in them. Mm-hmm. And it's because the idea of a painting has such preset ideas that weren't going to be helpful to me in my, and so I think, like, that idea of a perspective of something, or even something that has a use that's different, it can be valuable to allow you to see the work and let it develop on its own, in its own way.
Because you're just sort of fighting against your own biases in a way. Like, you have the ability to make this beautiful flowing expression, but what gets in the way is your feelings of preciousness or seriousness, or will people think this matches my old work? Will the gallery want to show this? All that is a brick wall in the middle of getting to that golden place. And so you're just trying to mentally get out. So working in the bed, it couldn't possibly be serious or important in the bed.
That's right. Frida Kahlo.
Except for Frida Kahlo or Matisse. But we won't talk about them. It's unusual.
Well, it's because, my husband died, and I have notebooks. I have like 4 notebooks of drawings of my feet and the television, because I just basically, that was where I was, and that's all that but the making of the work was my thread, my life, my raft. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's something also that, as is a wonderful thing. Like, in other words, the point of doing it, or the reason that you're doing it, is actually something that is, you know, like, you have to have it, or and other than that, it'd be too hard to try to do it. You know, it's like even, you know, we very nicely, Amy and Adi made this show, and I was in the show, and after that I just am now returning to thinking of making little heads again. I had to shift and make something else, because even in the most supportive and wonderful ways, it still is a different thing when you have that cozy relationship between, I guess, in a conversation, when you have the conversation. When you said it's a brick wall, it's because you're breaking the conversation between you and the work. You're putting this other thing in the middle of it that has no meaning at all, you know. And it's like, and since we're sort of harsh, like the you know, running narrative is
we're harsh. We're harsh on ourselves.
You're stupid. You're terrible.
You're never going to make it. It's over. You're a loser. I wanted to talk a little bit about shows. Okay, so because you said something really interesting to me, that your shows are always incredible to me. I find them really inspiring, but I was surprised to hear that you find a show itself to be like a brick wall, like a way you're in a flow and it breaks your flow. And so you try not to, like another artist, they might say, oh, well, I'm conceiving of this group and I'm conceiving of a show of this work and it's going to go here. You avoid that kind of thinking because it can really mess up your flow. Am I characterizing it? Could you talk a bit more about that?
Well, I mean, it's true and not true, because like when I did the City Court building, I never would have made those pieces unless I had looked at that rec room space
Right.
and thought, like, it's not going to be. And I think even in terms of, there was a show that I did at Betty's where I really did start to think I'm going to conceive of it as a whole show. Like, in other words, it's not going to be just that these are the paintings, the group of paintings, but that they relate to one another, and they're different, and thought of it as kind of like not designing a show, but take the parameters of the space and allow that as a kind of inspiration. So I don't, that's not the problem. Is that is the other thing that you were saying earlier. In other words, I start to have a unknown viewer who doesn't exist in the world, who is looking at the paintings at the same time I am. So instead of saying, you know, like if I'm looking at you, I'm starting to think to myself, am I stupid? Does this sound like a dumb thing to say, as I'm trying to say another idea? And I think that you know, I think that I've always thought that the pleasure of making things is one of the sustainable things that pushes away those kind of feelings. And probably it's really insecurity. You know what I mean? Like, I think that, and I think this is something that I saw from my mother in a certain way. Like, I imagine that we all have it in some ways, which is basically like when I'm here in the studio, sometimes these are the greatest things thank God I'm making these things. They're the gift to, and then when you put them out in the world, you realize like they're the things, like there's lots of other things, and they're not. And so when it's your world, you know, I love that feeling of being in the world, but I don't think that I think that I don't want them to be muted. I don't need to keep them here. So I think it's you know, actually, when you asked about the thing I said in, you know, about the grittiness.
Oh, yeah.
Because I think that the market is just so, being up here makes me realize that for me, the market is not a helpful thing. No, it has nothing to do with what I'm doing. And it's really like now I think like it's like the equivalent of evangelical church is the equivalent of a spirituality. In other words, they're just like basically, they might use the same words, but they're almost at the other ends of things. And I think like I used to think of it as a problem, but I think it isn't so much a problem to me now. I think it's just a part of the, you know, I think the part of my job, like I'm very lucky to have Betty and Betty support the work. And so that's nice to have a place that if I want to show it, that I can. But it doesn't, but it's very separated from my work in here. Like I keep thinking like, you know, if you can do it, if you can, you know, like get it, if you can manifest it before. And this did have the one show I did with Betty where it was kind of I didn't make work for the show, like it was all a work that I had done before, was a much better experience for me. Because
you mean when you conceived of, was it the one about Winslow Homer?
No, it was like a retrospect. It was like
a retrospective, and it was just all the work was already made, and so then it was just about cherry picking the ones that fit together, and that was a relief because you were still embroiled in your own work.
And these had the distance of time, so that everything had been made at a different time. Because I mean, even the one that, you know, the gift for Lila, I all, so I love, like I feel like with that one, like I love that painting, but I feel like I ended up sort of over describing it in a way at the end, in a way that I wouldn't have, just because I was conscious of the fact that it was going to go up on the wall. I mean, I guess it's a mixed bag, because like those paintings, they were made in a little pup tent. And I thought that I would just like on stretch things, but I thought I would just get stretchers. And when I started to stretch them, they felt like this, like the kind of
Right.
outside edge was so important about them, so that I ended up making, letting them breathe in a certain kind of way. And so those things were really important to me.
What do you mean pup tent?
When we first moved to this house, there was no studio. And so I just put up a little tent that I bought. It was like a gazebo. It was made of canvas. So there were no real walls. So every painting, so it was kind of interesting though, because it had no, like basically I used a little brush and the canvas would move. So it was very delicate paint. It was basically like me and like a dance, but it wasn't, I wasn't working against the
You
wall.
kind of fastened them to the top of the gazebo-y canvas and they floated about in the wind as you painted. That's amazing. That's amazing. Yeah, those paintings are very interesting to me. I wrote a little bit about them when there's all the little heads. I was like, I wrote down, I was like, well, how would I describe that series? I would say bubbling balloons filled with heads, bubbling up to the surface in a frenetic and dense way, suspended in solution or a stuff, an expanse, or material that's often white, but sometimes blue or gray. Emerging from a thick, creamy void, they contain multitudinous multitudes. That's how I would characterize the white paintings.
Well, it's funny because Gary, my husband, he said to me at one point, Judy, you're confusing a head with a face. Like basically they're bubbling up balloons, because I was making like basically like I would make just like a round thing and then put the face on the whole thing. So I started to try to understand like how there's a head and a face. And I was kind of making them into those balloons. But the ones that were on the tent, so those ones, like they were very thick. They were worked over for a very long period of time. The multi-headed one, and some of those, like I thought to myself, well, I have no criteria for if it's good or bad, but I can tell if I put a lot of hours into it. So it's like they were like labor intensive. But over the course of making them, sometimes they were kind of crusty. So when you made the next head, it was being defined by the crustiness of what was below.
Yeah.
So when I made the ones in the tent, they're on linen and they're very delicate. And I didn't want to have any surface telling me what the head was going to be like. It's often from one, I have definitely ping-ponged always from one thing to the other side. Like in other words, these were the superest crusty ones. Like how crusty could they be?
How crusty?
The ones that were like, they're basically pencil, like basically delicate drawings with paint.
Because you do have a whole series of these beautiful spare feather-light touch graphite drawings of figures. I'm trying to think, what am I going to ask you next? Okay, so I think I want to ask you about your characters specifically. I know that you've mentioned perhaps in thinking about making a book one day of your ideas, this idea of playing with dolls as a philosophy to making work, or how trying to return to that sort of childhood freedom, where you said that things are a plumber, the pipe is open and you're playing with dolls. And I was interested if there is a parallel between, sometimes your figures wear like little skirts or tutus, and I was thinking to myself, oh, a tutu, it reminds me of that Degas, the little dancer. And then I went down this even deeper rabbit hole to find out that you probably already know, people already know, this is news to me, that the original one is just made of wax. It's a pigmented beeswax, and there's like a real dress, and that's covered in wax, and there's real hair that's covered in wax, and everything's sort of crinkly and wrinkly because it's old beeswax sitting around in some gallery in the National Gallery in DC, but that it has a real tutu, and that all the other copies you see around elsewhere are bronze casts that were made after his death, so they weren't even made by him. And so once I learned that it was this crinkly, wrinkly, sagging wax, wearing a real tutu, it really connected to your work for me, because oftentimes you'll have these sculpey, which is a home craft clay you bake in your oven, or I think maybe plaster and different materials, clays, and you'll put a real tutu on a real skirt. So I guess this is a really long rambling just question, but what I wanted to ask is, could you talk a bit about, like, who are the characters? What is up with the skirts, and are they dolls to you? What's happening with the characters?
Well, let me just, the idea of playing with the dolls was that if you can make something, like maybe that wouldn't be the end. Like if you were a chef, you would eat the food once you made it. So what is our part of eating our food once we make it? Like we've made something, we're curious about it ourselves. So how do we kind of, and not even eating the food in the sense that it's, I'm looking for what's not working, but really just for the joy of it, the nutrition of it, just the experience of it. So it's the idea that somehow you could take these, and then like I said earlier, like the combination of being absolutely sincere about it, but not being delusional. Like, you know, that it's stand-ins for things, but you can really actually in a way say things even more truthfully. Like in a way, I would even go back to the idea of working at home, that you're disarmed, that you somehow, and so and then there's also the thing, like you said, the childlike thing, and also the idea that it's not, you know, nobody says like, oh, he's a genius, he played with his dolls. You know what I mean? It's like,
no one ever says that. That has never been uttered.
That is never in the canon.
It's very anti-canon.
Yes, it's anti-canon, and it's anti-genius, and it's anti, you know. So I think like and like I, you know, like again, it's outside of yourself. It's something that you're engaging outside in the world. But the tutus, you know, it was actually partly from, and I'm sure it was the Degas ballerina, but I had the, you know, I was doing etching, so I had the tarpaulin, I think it's called, that you clean the plate off with. So
I'm not very good with the etching, so I'll just take your word for it.
Once you ink it up, you have this thing which is like a cheesecloth. It's like a gauze, and it pulls off the extra paint, the extra ink, so that it just stays in the holes. So I had those in my studio. So they were kind of beautiful because the color of them had been made. And I love that idea. The color of them was made by their usage. The physicality of them was made by how they were actually used. But there was, and even I've made some with hats. And originally I have a very close friend from college. My very close friend was a hat maker. So I thought that both the tutus and the hats had a kind of way of kind of making like a circular aura around, like, so there was the head, and then there was this kind of like a membrane that almost protected or gave it a kind of you know, arena for its own space. But sometimes I would think that in my playing with my dolls, I would sometimes humiliate my dolls a little bit. So it's part of like making them, and then with part of the thing of the tutu, the idea that you were both you know, so like all dressed up with nowhere to go, like basically that they were kind of, and they're kind of girly in a kind of, you know, way. And I think sometimes the characters, especially beginning with the sculpey, they're both childlike, they're like have a consciousness of an adult, even though they have a childlike kind of quality to them. And even in terms of the paintings and the drawings that I did at that time, the heads were much bigger too, because it was sort of like the central focus was on that head. But the characters themselves are a cast of characters that seem to return to me. You know, like sometimes I'll have a thing happen where the cast of characters, like maybe your face will come out. Like sometimes if I'm talking to somebody for a while, like somebody that I say, like, oh, I recognize that person, I was just talking to them. But oftentimes there's some, and even you had said it about that they look like me. Like, so there's some kind of iteration of me, but mediated by the materials themselves. So the way that they become, like the first ones, the first ones that I did in 93, earlier than that, I had kind of pulled the figure out. So these were the first return to the figure. And they were really, it was right after David died. And they're intense. And I really love those paintings. And sometimes you make paintings that you long for them in a certain kind of way. And
they have a little bit of like, I would say they have a really thick, moody, melancholy atmosphere to them. The figure emerges out of the atmosphere. Yeah.
And in terms of the material, they were made of a lot of linseed oil. So, and over a long period of time. So things were kind of emerging, barely buried in gauzy kind of thing, and then coming through. And and then suddenly, like out of, you know, having no career things happening for me, suddenly people really responded very powerfully to the work. And even like me in my studio by myself, I'd be like, who came and made these paintings? I mean, it's like they scared me too, but they were also funny. And they were also the loss, you know, I just thought, like seeing their feet and stuff, that there was a kind of way that they were being revealed and concealed at the same time. So I got this attention, and I started to try to make them. And so I was only making the outside of what they looked like. You know what I mean? When you're like, I had worked on those for like a year, but now I was trying to make like the finished end thing.
Yeah.
And so they started. So I said, okay, they're like oversized because they were big babies. But that's only one piece of what they are. And that's how I sort of started to divide between the subject, which was, let's say, big babies, but the way that they're made was suspended in the linseed oil over time, coming in and out, almost dripping away. And so the meaning of them became something to do with, the idea of coming into the world and then disappearing in the world. Or even a kind of, like you said about doing things at homes, that there's a kind of an intimacy to knowing somebody. In New York, we're very protected in a way. Somebody doesn't get that close to your home, and they don't get to. So once they're into that intimate space, that's a very powerful thing. And
almost
so,
like the paintings were like represented a whole life.
That's right, the span of a whole life. And if you set out to do that, then you would be making a literal cliche of an idea. But in retrospect, that's right. That's what they were looking at. And I think that it's so interesting because we make objects. I make things in the world, but I think the idea of transience, or the idea of the thing being formed and then unformed, is really a big part of probably what we do, or an understanding of things, of the fleetingness of physical nature.
And the heads themselves have that sort of, they're fragments of you, but they're fragments of other people. So it's a little bit of that transient, trying to capture a little bit of somebody.
Yeah.
Or the whole life of somebody.
Well, like I think of the sculptures, but I think it's true of the paintings too. Like with the sculptures, I want you to think, when you're seeing this, of the interior world of the person that you can't see. And I think that's true with the paintings, with paintings too. Like we suggest a thing, but what's below it, what's above it, what happened before and after, all those things are implied by the little snippet that we're giving you of a kind of a peek into some kind of interior world.
Yeah, I think they really function that way. And I'm glad you brought up the sculptures, because you are currently, and I'm privileged to be witness to them coming out of the kiln. We both belong to the same amazing sculpture ceramics place called Ugly Mud. I might edit that out. I'll just say we both belong to the same sculpture place, and they are standing figures, but made in 3 pieces most of the time. So there's the legs and the middle and the head, and they're a bit wobbly, and the feet are a little bit kind of splayed, or rough, and then they're glazed, and oftentimes the mouths are open, and they have all different, as a group, as a little herd. I had the privilege of we showed them at this pop-up show we did in Upstate. They really have a power to them. They have a range of emotions, but you can't really pin down what emotion. It's almost like a Rembrandt. You feel the aura of emotion, but you're not sure exactly, or the emotion is so complex that it can't be named in one word. And I like the fragility of them, the way they balance barely on each other. Even one, there was glaze accidents that almost feel like kismet, like a glaze accident makes one look like it's weeping, but it wasn't intentional, and another one looks like he's surprised or sly. And then as a group, they really form an aura. I've looked at the work, of course, and I brought my own associations to them, but could you talk a bit more about what you're after with the new sculptural work?
Well, I was lucky enough to go to Venice for a month in January, and I had an idea, impractical. I really wanted to make sculptures. So I thought, like, okay, I'll make miniature sculptures. And so, and like I've said before, repetition allows me kind of in a very small range of things, allows me a pretty big expanse of things, so that I don't have to, one can be laughing, one can be not laughing. You know what I mean? It has that. Mm-hmm. So I really love these sculptures. And if I think about my paintings, or the idea of the framework that you provide, the framework, what I love about these little sculptures, when you look at them all together, is like you can feel that, like as if they're singing. You could feel the air coming out of them. Like basically, basically they're just things made of wax. If I poke my finger in them, they would bend. I could crush them. They would be nothing. But at whatever point that is that they stop, and actually a couple of them I worked a couple of times, which I always love if I can find a way back in, is like, it's almost like from being there, you can feel the inside of their air. You can feel this thing that it doesn't exist. And I was licensed to do it in Venice because I looked at those sculptures and I thought, like, that looks like I can make that sculpture. Like the little Pootie or the little,
oh yeah, the
little angels and things.
Oh, I know all about them. Yes, no, we've been doing a podcast about that era, so I'm like, oh yeah, I know all about the Pootie.
So it was like, but it was really amazing because I thought, like, these are little sort of cherubic, childlike, with the kind of consciousness in certain ways of not child, and they're. And I've done it so long. Like when you say, who are these figures and where do they come from? I think over time, because practicing is really a part of it too, like just the repetition of it, or you would asked earlier, maybe we'll talk about copying people, because for a long time I copied these portraits that David made. And they're like kind of, I looked at those portraits, I thought, like, oh my God, these are the good manifestations. This is what I want to do. It's just like, he's got I want to learn from him, but the people are the people that I relate to too. So I think, just as an artist, how wonderful that is when you connect to things. But there was something about the quality of, I don't know, for the people, whatever that was, but the sculptures on the outside of the buildings and inside in Venice kept inspiring me. And, one of the things about sculpture is that it's actual, right? So you want to make an eye, you just put your finger in it. And I think like that, it's the same as with painting. Like basically you squish it around, you keep moving it around, then suddenly like, wait a minute, this thing just became something else for a second. And you know how fragile that is. And so that kind of quality. And I think that's where the things with the clay are. I really also, again, I don't identify as a sculptor. So I think I give myself a lot of leeway, and also just to not trust yourself. Like I'm compelled to make these bigger heads now, but I sort of like, I think they're terrible. I'm moving forward, even though like the first one I love, now I think they're just awful, but I don't care. I'm going moving forward. But then somebody wrote me and said, oh, I love these big ones. So it's like, it's just, we are our own, crazy.
You're too close. You're too close to the big heads. Eventually you'll see them. You'll see how good they are.
Well, one of the things that I realized with them is that they do need the body. And that was a big shift for me. So even the ones from Venice to here, something about having and so like I said, those paintings in 2003 is where I gave myself license not to put the body in. And it's only now that I'm very gingerly saying, like, not only can you put the body in, but like basically the bodies are just hysterical. Like they're just basically like a clunk. I thought, it's funny because working at going to Ugly Mud, I still can't help but have the kind of self-consciousness of like, what is Paris going to think when he?
I know. It's true. But there's something about their fragility. Okay, so the heads in ceramics, if they're just the head, they're like a solid little ball. But your work is often about fragility. I think it's a core content. So you need that teetering body, barely held together, to give the fragility to the work. Whereas I think in painting, you can use transparency, a diaphanous treatment. You can, invent them in a teetering tower of heads, and so you get a fragility through the tools of painting. But I think in sculpture, like you said, it's an actual thing. You have to find fragility in different ways, and so to me, it makes perfect sense that you would need the bodies.
That's really interesting. As I think with the bodies, to me, I've made those heads so long so that I have ideas of what I like about them and stuff, but the bodies are very new for me. And I think in the greatest of ways, they're like that kind of quality of discovery, or how adding it to the head makes the head see how I see the head more clearly because I have that body. It's really my sister, she suggested, so in the heads even, it's like you said, it's like a ball. I started to poke holes into poke holes for the eyes, and open the mouth more, make the ears more porous. Partly because you told me they explode if you don't have enough holes.
Right. Well, the technique of ceramics is something I'm still trying to master.
But the other thing is that it's the bodies are just absolutely new, and I agree with you. It's the precariousness of that they don't fit together. That you're perpetually like trying to make them fit together, but you can see that they don't fit together.
It's a precariousness of life in a figure, in my opinion. I Okay, so I wanted to ask you an unanswerable question. How do you like how do you start work? Like, do you get a vision in your mind? Like you wake up and you have a vision, or do you just sort of go in letting the process tell you where to go? Or do you do both?
Well, that's the hardest thing, right? Starting something. And so I do like to kind of like I have a person that I started working with that I said to him, you're not starting. You have plenty of things to thread from. So don't feel like it's a start. Usually I'll have an idea. But I have like usually 3 different things that I have going on at the same time. And so like there's usually a 3-dimensional thing. There's usually some kind of a component that I would call like the drawing aspect of it, and then a painted aspect of it. And physically those things are so distinct in how they how much energy they take, the quality of the energy, that I can kind of wear something out in one room and just go over to the other room. But I also think that the subject of them is this desire to look in an interior. And so I was working, so the idea that I'm kind of giving myself license to kind of mine my intuition, to let that cast of characters out, is something that I worked on for a long time. And then for about 15 years, I didn't. And I only worked from, like you were saying about dark prayer, like it was all made observationally, but it was sort of like the way it related to each other. So these started because I was making some pieces, another group of pieces that I've been working on for a long time. Also, I think working on things for a long time is something that I've learned, like that's something that I've been able to develop that's, I think, a very hard thing to do. So I'm working on these things for a long time, and I started to make little shapes, and then just enjoy making these things up inside those little shapes. And I started to think, well, they're not on the surface of the paper. They're like people trying to get out of the paper to say hi to you. Like they're hidden from behind. So there was a kind of and that idea that I sort of perceived, I just sort of decided to, like the same as painting in bed. Like I just said, it's not a painting, it's a piece of fabric. So I saw it in a different kind of way, opened up the door to my imagination in a whole different way. And so right at this second, I feel like what you described before, like in other words, the group of people, the kind of idea, the community, or the idea that I'm just sort of building into this community is very liberating for me right now. And that the people are just as particular and specific as I can make them.
And the work, basically your work leads to work. So what happens in one work leads to another. And you, I've known you for maybe a year, maybe a couple of years, but you always have the most amazing painting, like ideas and philosophies, especially how to conquer when you feel blocked, when that brick wall is down in your face. And I have taken it upon myself to write pithy titles for all your very nuanced and complex ideas.
Oh, I can't wait. This is great. This is what I need.
I think I've already sent it to you, but this is what I call your artist block blockers. So not your beta blockers, but your artist block blockers. The seed, where like you take a work that you made and it's not a final product, but that actually it's a constellation of seeds. And each seed from every area of that work could spawn a whole nother plant that would also be a constellation of seeds. So that you're almost trying to make something that will be able to be spooled out in a million iterations. If you wanted, you could take the bottom right corner and make a whole body of work about that. You could take the middle and make a whole body of work about that. And every piece in that body of work would also have a middle that you could spool out and spool out and spool out. So it's sort of this infinite generative process is working with the seed. That's number one. And my pithy title is Seed Theory, like string theory, but seeds. And then another one is make a garbage painting or make a doodle painting, where you don't think about it ever being seen, or you have no plan and you just go in there doodling, which is a very liberating concept for me as somebody who was a planner, to just have a blank canvas and here we go. We're just going to put whatever we want over and over the course of the week. You can't be blocked through that. Like if that's just a complete exit door. You know, there's no way you could stay blocked. That's a little, you know, rabbit hole under the wall if you know that you have the power to doodle your way out. Another one is, we talked about this, bravery lives in the living room. And if your spouse is or your partner's annoyed, put it all in a basket. You know, yeah, you take over the coffee table. They're annoyed. They can't put their coffee down. Guess what? You swish it in a basket, boom. They're happy, you're happy. Invest in a basket. Everybody can be brave in the living room still. Put on the TV, make it the least precious environment possible. Also, another concept is the nosy next door neighbor, which is your idea that if you have a piece in your studio or your home, whatever's next to it could bleed in. You know, it could be peering in, it could be looking in. Nothing's just its own little island. It's all connected. And then one is be a bad art student, but I'm not 100% sure. Like, for me, it's like, let things have tangency, let things not be perfectly composed. That's kind of how I interpret it, but you may amend it a different way. And then another one I wrote is silly geese wear paper crowns. Which is when you said that you told your students to make paper crowns when they worked so that they don't feel like they're sitting there with their briefcase and their blazer off to have an art career. They are silly geese. In fact, they're childlike and full of play, and that they wear paper crowns. And I think that's a good mindset. And then I tried to wear a paper crown, but it was uncomfortable. So I just have it propped on my paintbrushes. And then the last one, which I just think about you in general, is if you think it, you have to make it. And so those are my pithy titles for your artist block blockers. Did I get anything wrong?
No, those are great. Those are fantastic.
Okay, so that was just what I wanted to share with the listener in case that helps them also. And then I wanted to also touch before we end about sometimes you have this interesting way of working in the past where you would do like a transcription or of like a painting or a series of works. So for example, you have this fun, amazing sculpture called After Donatello, which is like
way after.
Yeah, way after. But it's like a sculpture, and he's got these crude it's like a figure from a Donatello painting. He's got these crude wooden strips for legs, and he's got these clay feet that are similar to your current work, sort of raw and peeling off the wooden stake. He's got a dark clay or wooden face and these really enormous oversized hands that are maybe of wood or clay, and a little canvas shirt that's barely covering him. And so he's very raw. And then you have, you did a whole show, I think, inspired by Winslow Homer called Dressing for the Carnival, which is sort of a little bit like that seed idea that you take a painting by Winslow Homer and you spool out every iteration you can think of through your own filter. So there might be a painting of a singular figure from the painting and then another, and sort of going through you as the artist filtering through. And then I seem to remember in my research that you had been inspired by Guernica for a show. Could you talk a bit about what's so kind of fun about working from art history in that way?
Well, it's an expansive topic, but I wanted to I just wanted to say one other thing that you could make a pithy title for.
Oh, please.
But I don't know the title. You get the.
Let me get my pen ready. Okay, I'm ready.
Well, it's the idea between structure and intuition. And so the way that you're, like you said, you know, you take a part of it and you could bring it through your filter. And that's really essentially it's all that there is. But in separating these two groups, the thing that you can do is when you look at that painting that you're going to, you know, take seeds from, that you took an aspect of it, and then you do the thing to it, which I'm going to call, these are nameable things. In other words, do I make it bigger? Do I make it smaller? Do I make it turn around? In other words, the filter that you're going through are things that are nameable, very simple kind of things. What you're going to see, so now you have that seed and iterated in different contexts or in different ways. And even like we talked about, like you could look at that seed at nighttime and you could look at it at daytime. And so those are very clear things that you could hear. And somehow in the then necessary invention to do that is the kind of meat of the stuff, the intuition stuff. So that if you can separate out the structure from an intuition, it's more easy to see. The more categories you put into things, the more easy it is to sort of see them in relationship to each other. And so let's talk about, so then if you think about the taking a piece of work from somebody else and doing that, letting them be the seed. First of all, it's very interesting to have like no responsibility to authorship. In other words, it's not going to be a great image. I know what the image is from the beginning. It's not my image. It's not my problem at all. I'm just going to, it doesn't make me a good or bad artist. I'm just going to do emphatically go into to find the seeds so that they're not even connected to me. And so in that way, the choices that I make of what the seeds are is already reflective of who I am. And that becomes the kind of structure. And I guess it does really require repetition. So it requires that you do this thing over and over. So you have, as an artist, you have to find that thing. In other words, when I started to do the Guernica was when I felt I had used up all of my sort of interior imagination. I could tell you what the thing was going to look like at the end of it, because it was just no longer fertile for me. It was just the kind of stamp of what it looked like. Not
I think we can all relate to having gone through that. Yeah.
So when you hit that wall, I needed to refuel, and I also needed to learn. And I even think that so the first part was with the Guernica that I started thinking I can take the tools that I've developed, but instead of thinking of them as a kind of psychological self-portrait, I'm going to try to look at the world, and at that point we were in war with Afghanistan, and it was like we were living in a situation, like I said about AIDS, where we were sort of acting like everything was normal, but underneath there was all this stuff that was going on. And so I started to think about trying to make images of what would war look like to me. And even without, like as if the way that you constructed the painting would show you the content. That like if you took the alphabet and you put it together, you don't know the content to begin with. You have to make those things and make them learn how to look at them, but then you can see what that content is. But with the Goyas, I was also like muscle memory. Like it's a kind of a great thing to feel how the thing gets built. And actually we are the builder of the painting or the drawing, which sculpture shows you, it's like, and so like the idea that I could kind of feel his hand, clearly I wanted those, the disaster. And someone had given me a book of washes, of all the preliminary washes he did for the etchings. And I just couldn't believe how he's come
Goya. Yeah.
He's come up with everything before he makes those etchings. He understands. Then he builds it in the etching, printmaking form is different than direct wash. But it was just, so the Winslow Homer, it came at it in a way the same way. I wanted to start to talk about racism, and I didn't really know how. And I thought of the Winslow Homer, and I really didn't even like want to investigate what it was made for or anything. But it looked like a procession, like the painting was a theater, and a stage, but his color, it was really about spatial relationships that were my weakness. Like I wasn't really good with making, so I really was saying, the same as with the Davids. When I copied the Davids, I wanted to know how to build the form in paint, and this was just beautifully built form. But really it was it gave me the kind of armature or structure for me to, in repetition, to find my way into it. And so I think the idea of being separate from your work, it was very helpful in terms of that, because I was stepping into somebody else's shoes. I had our experiences we weren't living the same time frame. We probably thought of art in a very kind of different way. But the thing that they made that lasted, just like going to Venice, the thing that got made and lasted, I could step right into. I found my way in. And even that notion of the continuum of art, where it's basically, it's open slots. We get to come in and out wherever we want. So I was giving myself that freedom, but I also think that notion of, quote, the genius and the kind of inventor of things, it kind of dispelled that altogether, and it's like, if you're doing it in ballpoint pen, you know what I mean? Like, it's like the same as doing it in Sculpey.
Right. Like, we were trying to think once about like, what would be the most like sacrilegious medium you could do, and I think I came up with like ballpoint pen on linen, something like that. But Sculpey
using
is pretty
a pencil
low.
on linen, it was like I was thinking, like, are they going to arrest me? It's like so that you would draw on a painting, just do that. It's like, or Sharpie, I think, is one of those things too, because it's like so
Sharpie's bad, yeah.
Sharpie, Sculpey, it's like
all those lower materials I think have so much potential, because you don't need a lot of money or space to use them. You can do them in the living room. And so it empowers people who feel like there's this wall preventing them from making work. They could make work in the living room, as long as we all agree that it's fine. Genius lives in the living room. It's okay. But I was interested in your statement that repetition, so the transcription, like copying a painting, in other words, the repetition of that process and even repetition of the heads, you know from experience that if you just allow yourself to repeat and repeat and repeat, you will get to something unexpected and surprising. And that's sort of a process that you use to get to that meaning, that nugget of meaning.
And also the idea of the thing being surprising. It's something that I think as an artist you have to get used to. It's not like I'm totally shocked that this, you know what I'm saying? but the idea of looking or wanting to have that surprise, I think that's something that you have to almost train yourself to be comfortable with, because it's a very uncomfortable kind of a feeling. But one of the things that happened when I was painting David, those little paintings, is that at a certain point I realized I wasn't painting him at all. I was painting that sheet of paper that it was being distressed, little pieces of paint were being put on top of it. It was that piece of paper that I was referring to was a living document. It was you know, I dropped water on it, it changed color. It was like, so I thought that was really in a kind of a, you know, again, you could think of it as a painting. If it was a picture of him, I was more nervous. What was I going to do? You know, it had to give a certain standard, but if I'm making a piece of paper that's been distressed over time, no one's going to come in and check like that, you know, that spill wasn't there or anything. It's just like, it's the freedom to, and I think that is kind of the key, is the free, you know, like in other words, the repetition gives me a kind of a freedom. And I guess the other thing is, which is a challenge as an artist, is like, I'm copying Goya. Well, who do I think I am? And what do you, you know?
Yeah. The little tricks to trick ourselves into getting to the heart of our work is a whole thing in itself. You know, just like you said, working on distressed paper. I think sometimes when people you make the little digital sketches, I've been trying to find out a lot of people who've been doing that. Almost everyone is, but they don't show them to anyone, and they're not art with a capital A. But there's this whole legion of little phone doodles out there, because that's where people feel least pressure, most uninhibited. I'm so curious what's out there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I mentioned this, but when I was teaching at RISD, I used to teach drawing, you know, freshman foundation. So one student asked me, do you mind if I use my iPad? And I actually thought to myself, like, and I said, absolutely. But I had to think to myself, like, is that bad? You know, should she be using charcoal? And the thing about like Photoshop, it's so great in terms of drawing, is it's all layering. And so basically it's a great way to understand what's happening. And she was really good at it. Like you said, the people, these kids, this is like their, you know, extensions of their hands. It's like, and I thought that was such a funny prejudice on my part. Like, would that be okay to use that tool, which is like, basically, like you said, it's kind of a freedom. Because also you can erase it, you know what I mean? It's like,
yeah, you can undo.
You can undo a layer.
But to be devil's advocate, because I agree with you, but I'm trying to be devil's advocate. I'm getting out of my own opinion. But, you know, the idea that you go to a museum and you see Van Gogh's handwritten letters and his little doodles, and you'll see that archival object, that object that exists in history, but is here now, that he drew at a table, and you feel a connection to him as a human. Or working on a piece that has that buildup of history of not being able to just press undo. You have to struggle with that thing, and sometimes the struggle yields its own meaning. But I think that attitude that we all share gives a freedom to digital art, because we all think of that Van Gogh scrap as art. You know, when you're famous, everything you doodled on is art. Any little thing you touched is art. But the digital drawings live in this ether. They live in this other place.
Well, so you're like, you printed some out when we, you know, I think that to me, I've always thought like you have to get them out of that digital space in terms of looking at them, because that, and I guess over and over, like, it's not just that you find that motif, but that the process that you use, like when I was doing the Goyas, I did do some in pen and ink, but I tried to use a material that was like the Davids were made in acrylic paint. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
I'm not trying to like, I'm not, you know, forging it. I'm not trying to make it look like it's old, but I think that idea of presence, of the touch of the artist, or that thing that existed physically is a really, I mean, I'm a maker of objects, and I really do believe that the physical manifestation is a big part of it. But in terms of those phone things, like you said, there's so many other, even when I go back to the idea of miniature, like basically the scale of the things digitally is a very different thing too, because basically you could make it enormous. It's fixed by the thing that it's, you know, the carrier of what you're seeing it in, not the object itself.
Well, I'm interested in like how uncensored they are. I did an experiment on the Threads app. I kind of don't use it anymore, but it was the new app that came out of Instagram. And I said, everyone show me your secret phone doodles. And a lot of people did. And they were amazing. One of them had like calamari, like pictures of calamari. And they were just so uncensored, so joyful, so playful. I mean, they almost felt like that, like you were describing that East Village vibe, the sort of like, who cares? And I was very intrigued by the mental kind of freedom you feel in that app, because it isn't a beautiful art object. Anyway, I don't have a yes or no or a real point here.
I mean, I think because the answer is yes. They're all true, and it's like they feed each other. That's why I was saying, like, I have different things that I do for different physical relationship to it, and I have different energies to that. So like one might be, I mean, we all know that, like, that you walk in, you make that first move in a painting and it looks like, this is fantastic, I'd like to stop at this. It probably has that same kind of freedom, but it's like, I just bought this canvas, it cost me,
Well, that's a very interesting. I was just reading Diebenkorn's last list of notes to himself on making a painting. And he, like Matisse, has a quote saying, like, don't be seduced by that first wash because that prevents growth. You can feel like a little bit, it could be a fascist mark, it could be like, obey me and don't touch me, and now you're afraid to touch it. So that could be a negative. But on the other hand, recognizing that unconscious magical surprise or meaning is a skill that keeps the work fresh. So yeah, I don't know, I can see both sides. I think they're both in play.
Well, going back to the idea of the seeds, and I think this comes from being older, that I myself, like, in other words, if I say to myself, and it is repetition that gives me the freedom. So I say to myself, this one is the 2-minute one. And I'm going to walk away because I know I'm going to make another one that's going to be that doodle garbage painting that I'm going to work on. Like, it's going to like dog me till so it's like a kind of on the spectrum of what you can do, so that you're allowed to do both of them, because seeing impulse, there's nothing better than doing it on the most less self-conscious thing that you can.
Repetition, like, gets rid of the preciousness.
That there's a kind of a continuum, like, basically it doesn't matter if I believe this to be true, so that if I'm in here making a painting or making a sculpture, it's the same stuff, it's just made in a different way, so it allows me a different relationship to it, but at the core of it, it's the same people. They're made in different, you know what I mean? It's like, when you and sometimes you transition, so you can't be that's like, there's a transition when you're moving through things, but then there's another time when basically it's the same as you. The sculptures and the paintings are the same reality, they're just different. That one's a bigger view, one's a big world, one's a little intimate thing. It's the way that we experience everything. I mean, it's like, I think this Zoom thing is going to really impact the way images are made, because like the juxtaposition, like, basically I love to stack heads on top of heads, like you and I are stacked on top of each other, and
we're side by side in mine.
Oh, really? I don't know how to do that. But still, it's fascinating, right? It's images that are pulled out and put together in a way that's so I think that there's also, this is a hard thing, but very joyous, is the acceptance of like, basically, that you're in the living room, you have to, like, in other words, without all these strappings of things that make something important, which we really don't want to have in artwork, like, that's extraneous and limiting. So you have to kind of accept there's a kind of a, painful too, your limits, the limits of what we do, and the stupidity of it.
Yeah, but I think I think, like, one of the artists I love is Charles Birchfield, and he had a pretty mundane life. He had 5 kids, he worked at the wallpaper factory, but within those, he lived in Buffalo. Like, it could be like, what could be least romantic about that? It's the opposite of a de Kooning life. He wasn't buying villas in Tuscany, or it was a more humble life, but from that humble constraint, he came up with the most magical landscapes in watercolor, of all things, that are still affecting me.
because they're visionary, and I think that that is the thing of what an artist is. And even if it's so you have to have, and I love the Birchfields for even the idea that you take a little smaller drawing, put it on a bigger piece of paper, like 20
Very
years
Don
later.
Clements of him.
Exactly. But he saw the world, like he found, I do think about the idea. So one of my equations is that let me think what it is. Fact plus illusion equals truth, and that we are looking for truth. And so in some ways, the facts of the processes he made, because he did make those little drawings of emotions, those drawings.
Yeah, those are a little bit corny, but great.
Just like an amazing, I'm very like notation, very like there wasn't but the idea that he's looked at the world, but he saw it through the lens of his vision. And in some ways that allows it to enter, you to enter it, and me to enter it, and all these times later. I think like that. So the facts, I think that when I mean the facts and illusion, the facts are just like the things like it's 10 inches tall, it's made of white paper, he did it. But there's really the other fact is that basically the nature exists in the real world. There's a certain factualness of that. And it's kind of the truth of it, I think, is this. It goes back to the basic core of my thinking is in terms of dichotomy. So like the idea of it is that these things are simultaneously canceling each other out. You can't look at a painting of a horse and it's eight inches and go like, yes, I believe it's a horse, and I also know that it's an 8-inch piece of canvas. But that's what we do,
right?
And so that thing is that it's in those things trying to make one adjust to the other, that we have the little space for the thing that I'm going to call truth, which is basically something which is unnameable and undefinable. It's just basically it's a thing. It's not solid enough for us to be able, any words would be short shrifting it for whatever it is.
Yeah, I want to kind of like end on that because it was so profound, and I think that anyone who's an artist understands that. Like when people say, how do you know when a work's finished? You can't explain. You just feel that truth of maybe yourself looking back in some unexpected way, or it's unnameable, it's undescribable.
No, we make space for the unnameable. I think that's what an artist is.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that. Okay, I just want to say this feels so inadequate, but thank you for coming on. I just really admire your work, the way you speak about work, the way you really keep honed to that North Star of truth and honesty in your work. I think it's a great example for us, especially in this time of intense capitalism and money-making markets. It's refreshing and much needed to hear your thoughts. So just appreciate so much you coming onto the podcast and sharing your wisdom and your work with me. Thank you.
Amy, I have to say thank you to you. I think it's been such a pleasure I love your perceptions, even your quips, all that things like that. But I think you're really gifted even in doing this. And it's just a beautiful, gentle way that you have. It's really an exceptional thing. I love listening to you because it's really, and it's like you're thoughtful and you're prepared and stuff, but there also is something very generous, very generous. And I really have, it's so, the thing that we did, with 80, that there is a kind of an alternative. I think that is a community is a kind of an alternative to things that are less meaningful. And I think that's something that you really promote in your, I don't have my coffee cup here. I was using it this morning.
Yeah.
In your, and even in your podcast. So I appreciate having me, but I really value, interacting with you a lot.
Well, thank you so much.
Your friend.
I'm a blush. You've sent me to the blush. There's a good Dick Cavett quote too about like, he loves to compliment, but if he receives compliments, he feels utterly humiliated. Which is it. But thank you so much for those lovely words.